Um, there we go. And we're kicked off now. Fantastic. So as I was saying, thank you to all of you for joining us here today for our presentation on Fiscal Sponsorship 101, Understanding Your Rights and Protecting Your Project. Um, my name is Sarah Wiesner, and I'm very thrilled to be hosting today's webinar along with our partners at Adler and Colvin and the Office of Economic and Workforce Development. For those of you who are not familiar with my organization, I work for CORP along with my colleague Rachel Rapps. And CORP is a part of the Justice and Diversity Center at the Bar Association of San Francisco. We assist nonprofit organizations with transactional legal issues. And we also strive to provide informational resources, such as today's webinar, um, to support the work of nonprofits in our community. Our services are available to nonprofit organizations across Northern California, and they are entirely free of charge for all of the nonprofits who receive assistance. And so, for anyone who is interested in learning more about CORP or our services, we invite you to reach out to us at corp@sfbar.org or find us online at sfbar.org/JDC. And before we get started on our presentation today, I want to say a few words of introduction about our really fantastic presenters who are here with us. We're so thrilled to have Nancy McGlamory. She's a principal at Adler and Colvin, and she was trained in the law of fiscal sponsorship by Greg Colvin, who literally wrote the book on fiscal sponsorship. We really could not have asked for a better expert to be here with us today. Nancy's practice focuses on corporate governance and federal and state tax law matters for nonprofit and tax-exempt organizations. She has 2 decades of experience in working with fiscal sponsorships, and she previously served as secretary of the Nonprofit Organizations Committee of the State Bar of California and taught in the Masters of Nonprofit Management program at the University of San Francisco. So we are just so happy to have her today, and also her colleague, Wendy Hernandez, who is an associate at Adler and Colvin and also has significant expertise with tax-exempt organizations, including fiscal sponsorships. Wendy previously practiced at Farella, Braun, and Martell. She's the immediate past vice president and a current board member of the East Bay La Raza Lawyers Association. And she's also co-chair of the Barristers Tax Section at the Bar Association of San Francisco. So huge thank you to Wendy and Nancy. And now I will turn it over to them.
Thank you, Sarah. When do you want me to just dig into the agenda? Just kick it right off? Okay, great. That was a great introduction, so we don't need to add anything to that. The only thing we will just add is we welcome your questions. Many of you submitted questions in advance, which was wonderful. We'll try to get to some of those. If you have questions live during the session, you've got 2 options. You've got the chat, which we'll try to stay monitored amongst all of us. But if you'd like to just voice a question, as you'll see, let me just see if I can make this advance. We're going to split this into 4 parts. So if you want to kind of hold any live questions until the end of the part, we'll kind of signal that we're switching gears, and that would be a great time to ask any questions live that you have about the part that we just went through. So with that, let me just give you a sense of what we're going to cover. We're going to start, Wendy's going to kick us off by talking about what is fiscal sponsorship. This is a kind of table setting, level setting, whatever BizSpeak idiom you want to use, to make sure we're all on the same page about what fiscal sponsorship is and what it isn't. We'll also talk specifically about the 2 most common forms of fiscal sponsorship, which you may have heard called Model A and Model C, direct projects, Model A, re-granting relationships, Model C. Wendy will dig a little bit more into those. We'll then talk about, okay, so we'll cover kind of why fiscal sponsorship. Why might an organization or a group choose to use fiscal sponsorship? Assuming you do want to pursue fiscal sponsorship, how do you find the right fiscal sponsor? So we'll talk more about the kind of diligence that we recommend that potential fiscally sponsored projects pursue in looking for the right fiscal sponsor. Wendy's then going to talk about building better agreements. So you've identified a fiscal sponsor that you think will work. You feel good about it. Now, what do the agreements say? How is that relationship documented? And what should you look for and kind of get you familiarized with some of the really key terms that you want to see in a fiscal sponsorship agreement and that you want to better understand? Lastly, we'll talk about what happens when it's time to separate, either planned separations, which can be for all kinds of good and not so good reasons, and then unplanned separations, which generally are for not great reasons. And we'll talk about kind of knowing when you should move on and what happens if you're kind of forced to move on. Um, there's no magic wand, so just, there's no magic wand for fixing bad situations, but we hopefully by the end of this, everyone will feel more knowledgeable or validated in your existing knowledge, and more empowered to ask questions when you're looking for a fiscal sponsor. So with that, let's kick it off.
Great, thanks, Nancy. And I have to do a lawyer thing where we tell you we are lawyers, but we are going to talk about a lot of content that is not legal advice. But this is meant to be an educational webinar. So of course, hopefully you are empowered to ask away and we'll take it from there. So, okay, let's jump right in. So what is and what isn't a fiscal sponsorship? Let's start with what it is. A fiscal sponsorship is an arrangement or a relationship between a 501(c)(3) public charity, the sponsor, and a project entity or a project leader or group of people. It is a tool that's constructed in practice that uses existing legal principles. In a fiscal sponsorship, the sponsor will typically receive contributions from funders to support the charitable purposes of the specified project. The sponsor will hold the contributions in a restricted fund on its books until the sponsor uses and distributes the funds. The sponsor will retain the discretion and control over the money that's held in the restricted fund. So what does that mean? That means that the sponsor has the unilateral right to redirect the funds to a different project if it wishes to do so. But the sponsor will still be subject to using the funds subject to the charitable trust restrictions, which essentially means that the sponsor can only redirect the funds to another project that are aligned with the donative intent of the funds. Does this usually happen? Not really, but it is important for projects to know that it is a right that sponsors have, right? They can redirect the funds. So for those of us that are visual learners, we have a little picture here that shows you what a fiscal sponsorship is. So the fiscal sponsor here is housed in this purple box that you see. The funds will come from an outside funder. You see the funder depicted in the yellow circle. And the funds will be held within the fiscal sponsor in a restricted fund. That's that dotted green line you see inside the fiscal sponsor. That's what a fiscal sponsorship is. It's also, sometimes it's often the motivation for a project comes from outside of the fiscal sponsor, even though we see in this picture, the fiscal sponsor is we'll see in the next slide, the fiscal sponsor will house projects separately, but the motivation for the project will typically come from outside the sponsor. And of course, it's common for the sponsor to provide some administrative support for the project. Next slide, please.
So, and before we jump, I just want to point out that some of the things that we're going to talk about, Wendy's going to talk about why people might use fiscal sponsorship. So there's some good reasons for why you might, and we'll get to those. But already you're probably starting to see some tensions. So this notion of the sponsor having discretion and control over those funds. So they receive this funds from the funder. The funder says, I want to support the purposes of XYZ project that you are fiscally sponsoring. And so I'm going to give you fiscal sponsor this money. And the fiscal sponsor says, great, everyone agrees, this is my money. Yes, I have to use it for these specified purposes, but it's my money. There's already a tension there because the project who's doing the work may feel a sense of ownership. So well, that'll play out a little bit more as we go along, but I just wanted to flag that as, the sort of control versus flexibility that's inherent in fiscal sponsorship is one of the key kind of tensions.
And I see a question in the chat that I think I can just answer now. The question is, can you say more about what charitable trust restriction means? I wasn't aware the fiscal sponsor relationship involved a trust. It does not involve a trust, so thank you for flagging that.
Not in the classic sense of right, of
Of a trust,
trust
right?
in
But
the
when we
right.
talk about charitable trust restrictions, that is a legal concept. And what that means is just that if I am a donor and I make a donation with the intent for it to be used for Project A, the purposes of Project A to be, let's say, solve world hunger, um, then the sponsor has to use my money to solve world hunger, whether it's in Project A, Project B, C, D. That is the charitable trust restriction. It is essentially ensuring it's a restriction for the sponsor to use the funds aligned with the donor's intent of the donation.
And it's a pretty ancient concept. So it is codified in most states' laws. The notion of that donor intent kind of impresses the contribution, the donation with this notion of charitable trust. But it isn't. So it's an ancient concept, but it's not a tax law concept. And although it shows up sometimes in corporate law, it's an even more broad kind of concept of sometimes some of these kinds of concepts you can also think of it almost like consumer protection, where the consumer is the funder. That the state wants to make sure that if a donor is giving money for charitable purposes, but has specified a more narrow purpose, that the party holding those funds is abiding by that purpose. Okay. So, and I wanted to emphasize too, one thing that's different about fiscal sponsorship, Wendy mentioned it, that the motivation for the project or for the work is usually coming from outside the sponsor versus, any operating charity can develop its own program, and may do work that involves grant making or involves direct activities. But that's different than fiscal sponsorship, where usually the project is coming to the fiscal sponsor to look for support.
And
Okay.
I'm looking at the chat. I see Bill Hubbard's question about sponsor discretion, and he's
Yes.
asking whether it's basically the same as variance power. The answer to that is yes. I see Sonika's question. We'll answer that one at the end of the section just to keep us moving forward. Okay.
All right. So what isn't it?
So what isn't a fiscal sponsorship? A fiscal sponsorship is not defined in the Internal Revenue Code or any law, really. It is a sponsorship. It is not a fiscal agency. Fiscal sponsorship doesn't mean that the sponsor lets the project borrow or rent the sponsor's exempt status. As we see here, the image again, a fiscal sponsor is an arrangement, and it's a tool that we've used that has been developed in practice to essentially allow this relationship to work.
Right. So, and sometimes we start conversations like this by doing a sort of deeper history and kind of, outlining how we even got to a place of having this thing called fiscal sponsorship. But it really was an evolution of practices, because there were these practices where there were public charities that were working with groups and were essentially, functioning in this certain way, and there wasn't really a good name for it. And a lot of people were calling things fiscal agency that weren't agency relationships. They were really substantial sponsorship relationships. And so this concept was developed in part to help describe better in a concise way what we mean when we're talking about those kinds of relationships. And to that point, talk about some good words and some bad words.
Yeah, so we're talking about understanding the landscape of fiscal sponsorship. I think it's important, we think it's important to have good hygiene and use the appropriate terminology to describe the relationship. So what are some bad words? Fiscal agency, fiscal agent, earmarked for, a conduit, a shell, a pass-through, autonomous, funnel, laundry. All of these words are not great for describing the arrangement that you have in a fiscal sponsorship. The better words that we suggest using to describe the arrangement are fiscal sponsorship, fiscal sponsor, to support the purposes of X project. Sponsor has the discretion and control over the funds, a regrant, accountable, steward, umbrella. Why are these bad words? Why does it matter? Well, these bad words on the left side of the slide aren't great because if you look at the thread of these words, they lean towards describing the relationship in a way that implies that the project is borrowing the sponsor C3 status. And that's not what a fiscal sponsorship is. So
Or
it really
even,
does matter
oh,
to use the appropriate terminology. Go ahead, Nancy.
right. And I think a lot of the words on the left really are all variations on this notion of fiscal agency versus fiscal sponsorship. So let's pause for a moment and talk more about both what that means and why it matters. So fiscal agency, the key word there is agency, of course, that's the big difference. And that has a real legal meaning. I think part of the issue with fiscal sponsorship and people saying fiscal agency when they mean fiscal sponsorship is that they're over the years, the connotation of fiscal agency has sort of applied even when people mean fiscal sponsorship. But let's pause. Wendy and I are lawyers. We'll talk about the legal meaning. An agency usually implies, if you are an agent, that, especially when you're talking about money, that you are holding money, but it's not your money. So you are holding money for the purpose of essentially giving it to someone else whose money it will be. But that's not what's happening with fiscal sponsorship. This notion of the fiscal sponsor, which is the 501c3 entity, it is a 501c3 public charity, receiving the funds, having stewardship over those funds, making sure that the funds are used for the purposes for which the funder gave them, and then, making disbursements either in re-grants or using the funds for direct expenditures, that there is that real there. Whereas in an agency relationship, that doesn't exist. So why do we care other than just making sure that we're, using words that seem to be more aligned with the facts? Well, there's several folks who may care. And the biggest group who cares are the funders. There's this notion, the third one down here is that the bad word is earmarked for. The reason that's a problem is because if a funder were to give money to an agent, let's say, and say, okay, I'm giving you this money, but you can only use it to give the money to this non-C3, this other entity or this other individual. For tax purposes and for accounting purposes, that is treated as if the funder gave the money directly to the ultimate recipient, right? If it's just a conduit relationship, just an agency relationship, it's as if they gave directly. If I'm an individual funder, then I probably am assuming I'm going to be able to treat that as a deductible charitable contribution. If I'm a private foundation, that will mean that I probably want to be able to treat that as if it was a gift to a public charity for reasons that have to do with restrictions on private foundations. Similarly, you may have heard of donor advised funds. They have restrictions on who they can fund. So if they're not making that transfer of funds to an actual 501c3 public charity that is legitimately holding the funds and exercising discretion over their use, then the funder doesn't have the treatment that it was expecting. And so that is one of the really fundamental set of reasons why it matters, and why it's important for everyone who's talking about the relationship to be using the right terminology. I know I went on for a while about that, but I think that sometimes I have definitely seen people roll their eyes when we say, oh no, not fiscal agency, fiscal sponsorship, as if there are no consequences, but there can be actual consequences, especially to funders. For the fiscal sponsor, it matters because they want to be able to report accurately that it is their funds. So, okay. Should we move on or let's see? Yeah, let's move on. All right, talking about specific models.
Okay, so there are many models and many ways to set up a fiscal sponsorship. Today, we're going to talk about the two most common ways. So Model A is one of those, the direct model. And in Model A, the project is legally part of the sponsor. The project is not a separate legal entity. The project leads and personnel are often the sponsor's volunteers and employees. The sponsor is liable for the project's activities and the employee's actions when they're doing work for the project. Any gifts, grants, contributions that are made to support the project's purposes belong to the fiscal sponsor. Any assets that are generated by the project, for example, any IP, belongs to the sponsor. The sponsor reports the revenue and expenses to the project, and the project may have an advisory committee depending on how it's led. It may be one individual, maybe a group of individuals. So back to our visual here, we have, again, fiscal sponsor is the purple box. We see the restricted fund where the donations are held from the funder. And here in Model A, the project assets, the project staff, anything related to the project are housed within the fiscal sponsor. So you can imagine in Model A, to loop in Sonika's question where she asks, does a conflict of interest arise if the ED of the sponsor is part of the project or leading the project? You can imagine in a Model A where the ED may be involved in some role within the project because the project is legally part of the sponsor. It may not be common because the ED may have different functions, but legally it wouldn't be an issue.
It's all in-house. So one thing that I think of when I think of Model A and the direct or comprehensive fiscal sponsorship versus Model C that we're going to talk about next, or really any flavor of fiscal sponsorship, I'm thinking about who employs the people who do the work, project work, who owns the results of that work. So the assets that are either the assets that are generated by that work, often intellectual property, could be other things. And if something goes wrong, who's probably liable? And the answer to all those questions in a classic Model A is the fiscal sponsor. Now, you may have seen as the practice in the sector has developed, there are different flavors of even Model A that are a little beyond our scope, but this is sort of the classic Model A fiscal sponsorship. And we'll contrast that with Model C.
Model C, which is one of the two most common fiscal sponsorships. So in a Model C, we have a pre-approved grant relationship. What does that look like? Here, the project is conducted by a separate legal entity. That's a big distinction from Model A, where it's not. Which is a grantee. The grantee can be a nonprofit corporation that is in the process of applying for their 501c3 recognition. It can be a different type of nonprofit organization, for example, a 501c4. It can be a for-profit entity or even an individual. In a Model C, the sponsor again receives the charitable contributions to support the charitable purposes of the project. The sponsor will hold the contributions in the restricted fund and retain the variance power, the discretion and control that we've been talking about, over the restricted fund. Both parties will enter into a fiscal sponsorship agreement that covers the sponsor's grants to the grantee out of the restricted fund, or a grant agreement. Here, it's all documented in the fiscal sponsorship agreement, and we'll talk about what that looks like later. In Model C, the project belongs to and it's operated by the grantee. The project assets and the liabilities belong to the grantee. The project personnel work for the grantee. Again, those three big distinctions from Model A. And here, the sponsor will report contributions in and grants out, and the grantee is also reporting grants in and expenses out to the fiscal sponsor. So to bring us back to our visual aid, we have the fiscal sponsor, again, purple box, funder. The funder is donating to the fiscal sponsor. The funds are held in the restricted fund. But here you see the grantee, the blue box, is now outside of the fiscal sponsor, and that's supposed to represent that grantee is a separate legal entity. It's not within the fiscal sponsor like it is in Model A. Okay.
Yep. So all of the assets, so also think about, in Model A, we mentioned that, the funds come in and they may be dispersed in the form of expenses, paying staff or hiring contractors, paying bills that are associated with the project's activities. But here, the money comes into the sponsor and then it goes out in the form of a grant. And then the grantee is the one who is incurring those expenses and paying those personnel costs and all of that. In terms of the reporting to the IRS, the sponsor is reporting, everything that came in as contributions, gifts, grants, contributions in, and then it is reporting the grantee as the grantee that's operating the project as a grantee. Whereas on the grantee side, it's reporting gifts, grants, contributions from the sponsor, and then it's reporting those expenses, just like the sponsor did under Model A. So let's see. I think that's probably good. And I know there's a couple questions that we'll come back to before we move on to part 2.
Yes. Okay, so why use fiscal sponsorship? I know many of you in this webinar are probably already in a fiscal sponsorship arrangement or maybe are seeking, but just for purposes of understanding the landscape and level setting, we wanted to talk a little bit about the benefits of these kinds of arrangements. For projects, specifically in Model A, the benefits include the project being able to obtain funding prior to obtaining its own C3 status. A project it also allows for a project to explore proofs of concept. So a project without a track record of success has the opportunity to do the work before having that track record that will eventually attract funders. It also allows for an incubation period and a pace of growth that matches the mission and opportunities of the sponsor. And last but not least, it allows the project to benefit from a robust infrastructure from day one, not having to worry about the back office things and administrative things of running a nonprofit organization, but more so focusing on doing the work. For funders, the benefits include for individuals, the ability to support projects with, like I mentioned, with unproven track records or just projects in general, and obtain that tax deductible charitable contribution on their personal income tax. For institutional funders who may have other restrictions, for example, private foundations or donor advised funds, it allows them to widen the scope of what they can fund. And of course, the funders will have assurance of having a fiscal sponsor's oversight over these projects.
So should we open, so we're gonna shift gears now next to due diligence and finding the right fiscal sponsor.
Yes.
So before we go there, I just want to look in the chat. Let's see. Okay. Someone asked about how an individual can be a legal entity. Well, individuals are legal persons. The entity is, you're right, usually colloquially you don't say entity when you mean an individual, but it does mean a legal person, just like a corporation's a legal person. So the question was, I assume that this was when we were talking about Model C, can the Model C grantee be something like a neighborhood or community group without legal status? There should be someone who can be a counterparty to the agreement. Actually, I think Wendy in part 3 is going to talk a little bit about what that sometimes looks like when you've got a group of people who want to be in a direct project. But similar issue can come up. Who's signing the grant agreement? You can have groups like that that are essentially unincorporated associations that, for kind of purposes of being able to enter into contracts, are kind of the legal body or the contracting party for those purposes. So that is possible. Can Model A fiscally sponsored projects become a public benefit corporation, or would that mean they become Model C? if I understand the question, I mean, typically if you're talking about um, if you've got a separate legal entity, again, there's lots of different flavors of every form of fiscal sponsorship, but in kind of classic Model A, classic Model C, typically if you're talking about a separate entity from the fiscal sponsor operating the project, then usually they're going to be receiving regrants, under a Model C kind of framework. And we are going to talk about best practices. Um, so we're going to get to there in a little bit. Okay. Wouldn't the project need to qualify as charitable for public benefit? So unfortunately, public benefit when you're talking about entities means different things depending on the state. So I'm going to, um, if anyone wants to clarify the question there, we can come back to it. But public benefit is, for example, in California, if you wanted to pursue 501c3 status and you were incorporated in California, you would incorporate as a California nonprofit public benefit corporation. Okay, great. Public benefit is in the title. By contrast, if I go to Delaware and I incorporate in Delaware as a public benefit corporation, that is a stock corporation. That is not going to be an organization that could apply for 501c3 status. Public benefit is in the names of both statutes, but it depends on where you are. Okay, so if any other questions and I think people can holler out if they do have or use the raise hand function. If not, we will move on to finding a fit. But of course, if you have questions, we expect we'll probably have some time near the end to also have questions. Okay, so let's assume that you're convinced, or maybe you were already convinced before you got here, and you know that you want to use fiscal sponsorship. You've got a project, maybe you are a fiscal sponsor. We're talking, most of this part of the conversation is about projects finding a fit with fiscal sponsors, as opposed to fiscal sponsors finding a fit with projects. But of course, some of this can go both ways. Sponsors should absolutely be doing diligence on their projects, and maybe that's one of the things that you should make sure when you're kicking the tires of a potential fiscal sponsor. One of the things they should be doing is also kicking your tires. That's probably pretty important. But okay, due diligence. What do we mean? So there are both kind of broad questions that you should be asking, and ones that are maybe a little more detailed, but you should be asking a lot of questions. This should be like any kind of diligence endeavor, any important relationship. You want to make sure you really understand the party that you're getting into a relationship with. So part of that means really making sure they understand what it means to be a fiscal sponsor, what fiscal sponsorship entails, what is typical for best practices. We'll get more into some of those, but they really should understand what it means. Now, depending on the type of organization that it is, meaning whether they have ever done this before, or they're just a kind of good neighbor fiscal sponsor who is helping you out because you share, you have mission alignment, they may or may not be super familiar. So, there are situations where I've seen potential projects work with fiscal sponsors that don't have a lot of experience or have no experience in being fiscal sponsors. And you can learn together, but you just that can be a little risky. So back to other questions you should be asking at a broad level. You should make sure you understand a fiscal sponsor's capacity. What does that mean? That means both their size, how well they're staffed, but also what do they have going on? What are they managing? If it's an existing fiscal sponsor, how thinly is their staff spread in terms of oversight over the projects? Do they have the kind of financial capacity? Do they have reserves? How well are they thinking ahead beyond just one step in front of the other? At the end in the resources, we've got a link to Neolaw Group has a really great list of some additional factors that you should consider. So I urge you to check that out as well. You should also make sure that the fiscal sponsor understands their other legal obligations. So we talked about what it means to be a fiscal sponsor and understanding that notion of discretion and control and understanding what it means to report the assets as your own and I mean, all the things that we talked about. But there's a lot of other legal obligations that any going concern has, but specifically fiscal sponsors may have as a result of the fiscal sponsorship they're engaged in. So for example, if you have an operating charity that is working primarily in the Bay Area and primarily fundraises in the Bay Area, they may not have a lot of obligations for registering in other states, either registering to do business or registering as someone who is soliciting, doing fundraising in the state. But if you're a fiscal sponsor and you start to have projects that direct projects that are going out and using your name, your sponsor's name, to solicit funds to do fundraising, or have employees in other states, the fiscal sponsor may have legal obligations in those other states with respect to registration or otherwise. So you want to make sure they understand all the legal obligations that may attach as a result of being a fiscal sponsor. You should be able to review their annual tax return, their 990, assuming they are large enough. They hopefully have audited financial statements, and they absolutely are required to, depending on where they're located in and their size. I mentioned there's sort of a spectrum of fiscal sponsors in terms of their how much experience they have with being fiscal sponsors. And it's not always necessarily the case that you have to work with a fiscal sponsor that has a ton of projects and has been doing this for years. But if you are working more with a good neighbor sponsor, you should be doing a lot more. You should make sure that you're really, really kicking their tires on all of this other kind of capacity issues and knowledge issues. Obviously, if you're looking for direct fiscal sponsorship, you're not looking for a fiscal sponsor that only does Model C regranting. There are those that only do Model A or only do Model C. And then another few issues to look for or questions to ask, types of questions to ask are about whether the fiscal sponsor is more of a generalist or sector or subsector specific. So it's common for more kind of quote unquote professional fiscal sponsors or organizations that primarily or exclusively do fiscal sponsorship to really be pretty generalist. You know, they may have an overall kind of flavor. They may be more progressive. They may be more focused in a given geography, but still are relatively generalist. And then there are others that are really focused on specific types of projects. So you see a lot of arts related fiscal sponsors that are really specific to the arts, whether that's performing arts or otherwise. And so depending on the type of project you have, it might make sense for you to look for a fiscal sponsor that is more sector specific because of the kind of resources, network, just expertise that they have. Another kind of whole set of questions that it's important to ask and to make sure that there's alignment on is the fiscal sponsor's approach to oversight and compliance. So of course, the lawyers are going to tell you less is not more, less oversight is not better, even though it may feel nice to have lots of freedom and flexibility. But if a fiscal sponsor isn't minding your store, your project store, they're probably not minding the other project stores or their own store very well. So there needs to be a balance between oversight and trust. And so making sure that you're asking questions that get at that issue is really important. It also, of course, can lead to, can bolster or diminish trust, which is, of course, a fundamental aspect of every relationship. Finally, of course, reputation. You should get references. You should talk to other project leaders and you should, do a Google. To get a little more specific before we shift out of these gears, and Wendy, I hope you're checking some of the chat. So to dig in a little bit more on some other things that are best practices that you in doing your diligence should be asking about. The fiscal sponsor should have really clear accounting policies. They should understand fund accounting, meaning they should understand how to receive and hold funds that are restricted for certain purposes and account to projects for and funders for those funds. Back to compliance, they should be doing periodic compliance reviews. They should also be doing, as I said, diligence on the front end. The sponsor should have a reasonable diligence process for making sure that what the project is doing is consistent with the sponsor's mission, is consistent with 501(c)(3, and they should be doing periodic reviews to make sure that the project is acting in a manner that's compliant, regardless of whether it's Model A or Model C. Really, though, the level of oversight is higher at Model A. The agreements should be standardized. I mean, there's one size doesn't fit all, but there should be a really solid a suite of contracts and policies that govern the relationship. You can ask for those. You don't have to be all the way at the end of the process and ready to sign an agreement to want to know what those might look like. Communication should be a real priority. This also goes to almost like a customer service kind of mindset. Sponsors should really want to maintain and be able to demonstrate that they're good at maintaining communication with projects. A lot of this goes to how well staffed the sponsor is, and whether it's having the knowledge that they need and the capacity that they need on the finance and accounting side to both manage the funds, but also manage your accounts payable that might, be related to the fund, to the project, all of that. They should have some legal capacity, not necessarily in-house legal support, though that can be great, but someone on speed dial that they can ask questions when they come up, as opposed to just trying to DIY the legal aspects. There should be some HR support, especially if they're doing Model A projects where they're employing the project personnel. And as I mentioned, sometimes there are sectors where it's really helpful to have sector-specific expertise, depending on the nature of the projects. I mentioned capacity. One aspect of capacity is, being financially secure. One aspect of financial security is having the right level of administrative fees. So all of this fiscal sponsorship we've talked about usually comes with some amount of administrative fee. There's usually something that the fiscal sponsor is charging to manage the funds that come in, to manage the expenditures if it's Model A, or to manage the grants if it's Model C. And in your good neighbor scenario, sometimes you get kind of a friends and family rate, and that may not be enough to actually cover the fiscal sponsor's costs of carrying the project and administering the project. So it's a good idea to make sure that both being too low and too high can be red flags, I guess, to summarize. If an administrative fee is too high, you might want to ask why that is. And if it's too low, you want to make sure that it's the right amount to actually keep the sponsor from being tempted to move restricted funds into its general treasury to pay for its overhead, which of course I know is a question that's probably coming up for a lot of people. The other thing about fees is you want to make sure they're very clear about what is and isn't covered by the administrative fee. Certain extraordinary expenses are often not covered. They may come directly out of the restricted fund. You should know all of that. And I know I'm going on and on. I think a lot of this it's just, there's a long list of things that you should do, but it really condenses down to a set of questions that I think any sponsor that is going to be a good fit should be happy to answer. The last thing I mentioned here is to have clear guidelines about fundraising. I mentioned fundraising in terms of how it creates legal obligations, but because the fundraising is really fundraising for gifts, grants, contributions to be made to the sponsor. The sponsor's name should be in the fundraising, but also the sponsor should have some guidance, some guidelines for projects about how to use their name and their branding elements. Okay, so before we move on, Wendy, what did I miss?
We can pause. There were a couple questions in the chat that I went ahead and answered. I'll read them out loud.
Mhm.
A follow-up from the question earlier about a Model A fiscally sponsored project becoming a public benefit corporation, or would that mean they become a Model C? We got clarification that the person asking the question said, we have a Model A fiscal sponsor agreement where the project is interested in preserving their IP and having a legal name, not housing their own employees. They raise interest in filing to become a public and benefit corporation. Is this possible? So we responded, it sounds like the project wants to create their own legal entity. In this case, it is possible to change the relationship from what sounds is currently Model A to a Model C. As we talked about earlier, one of the distinguishing traits in Model C is that the project can be a separate legal entity outside of the sponsor, whereas in Model A, the project is legally part of the sponsor. So we got a thumbs up. I think that that person was satisfied.
And I see that Alexander, absolutely, I agree with you that all of the diligence questions should, or if not all, at least certain key ones should be revisited as staff turnover, or there should be an expectation that there's a regular training program that the sponsor has to make sure that its staff remain, that everyone is always knowledgeable about the things that they need to know. Oh, sorry, Wendy, did you?
Oh, go for it. That one hasn't been answered yet, so maybe.
Okay, so appropriate amount of administrative fees the sponsor should charge. There isn't really a right answer on that. I mean, we usually tell people, well, we see an average of 5 to 15%, but honestly, it does depend. And for example, if you're either any model of fiscal sponsorship, but you are getting funds, government grants, for example. Any government grant is going to trigger a lot more compliance on the sponsor's part than just getting a grant from a garden variety, private foundation or individual. So it is absolutely reasonable for a sponsor. Not every sponsor does this, but it's absolutely reasonable for a sponsor to charge more for projects that do fundraising with, for government grants. So that's one element. Some fiscal sponsors will charge a lower administrative fee, but charge like a setup cost. That may be totally reasonable, especially if it's a way to keep the fees low. I didn't say this explicitly, but typically the fee is charged on the inbound funds, right? So gifts, grants, contributions that come to the sponsor that are restricted for the support of the purposes of the project. A percentage of that is usually what is charged. So I think it depends on the circumstances. It depends on the complexity of the project and the sources of the funding. Any particular paperwork? No. Oh, I'm sorry. I see. Yes, but potential fiscal sponsors are 501. I mean, this is 501c3 public charities. It doesn't really work nearly as well for a sponsor to be a private foundation because there's so many more restrictions on how private foundations can spend their money and the kind of grants they can make. So generally, it's 501c3 public charities. The C3 decides to expand services to include fiscal sponsorship. Yes, I think if it's a pivot, just like anytime you're changing your activities, materially, there are questions on the IRS tax return on the Form 990 that try to get at those kinds of changes. So that could be something that you disclose as bill notes. Yes, you probably do not need to file another 1023. You shouldn't have to apply again. I will say this is a little bit of a gray area, how far off the application you filed, because the IRS, they approved your C3 status based on your original exemption application, if you're a C3. And so if what you were doing now is so far off that, And is, clearly, well, if it's so far off, there, it raises the question of whether you should file another application. Um, I think usually well, I'll leave it at that. It's a question you should ask counsel, I think, because it really depends on the circumstances. Did we get through the current crop?
Yep, we got to the
Excellent. Okay. So now we're going to shift gears. So I was talking about how to help you diligence finding a fiscal sponsor that you feel confident knows what they're doing, will be accountable, is running their shop in a way that it's sustainable, all that good stuff. So you've decided, and so now what? Oh man, that was supposed to be a dramatic. There you go. Go ahead, Wendy.
now what? Great, thanks, Nancy. Okay, so we're going to talk about building better agreements. So like Nancy said, you found a fiscal sponsor. You've decided in this case that you want to implement Model A. What does that look like? Here, the project leadership or the individual that's spearheading the project will propose the project to the sponsor. The sponsor's board will review the proposal and approve the fiscal sponsorship, assuming it's consistent with the sponsor's mission and the charitable purposes. The project director or the committee will then establish a contract with the sponsor. So here, from a legal perspective, it can be a little tricky because, as most of us know, it's not possible to enter into a contract with yourself, right? There, it requires two parties. So as you recall from the Model A visual, in Model A, the project lives inside of the fiscal sponsor. So in order to have a counterparty, the way that this looks for documenting the fiscal sponsorship agreement, we went ahead and just screenshotted what that first paragraph looks like. So
May look like one
may look
possibility.
like, correct. So the fiscal sponsorship agreement will be entered into by the sponsor, of course, and either if we're in the case where the project has one individual as a project lead, this agreement will be between the sponsor and that individual will sign on behalf of the project. If, however, it's a group of individuals or we will call it an advisory committee, then we will go ahead and name the advisory committee, and for purposes of the counterparty, we will reference that advisory committee as an unincorporated association. So then those group of individuals will have the ability to countersign the agreement.
We know that works in California because California, by statute, acknowledges the existence of unincorporated nonprofit associations. So that works. Since we're all here in California and it's hosted here by BASF, that's probably all we need to know. But there are other states where it may not be quite as crystal clear how that works, but we know this works in California.
Yes, next slide, please. In Model C, this looks a little different. So Model C, as you may recall, is a pre-approved grant relationship. So there is a specified grantee, right? Here we will have the written grant proposal from the grantee will go to the sponsor. The sponsor will then evaluate the proposal. Then the sponsor's board will approve the proposal. And then we will have the written grant agreement, the written fiscal sponsorship agreement that basically outlines all of the grants, or it may be one big grant, or it may be a series of individual grants that may be going from the sponsor to the grantee. It will be captured, regardless of the form of the grant, it will be captured in that fiscal sponsorship agreement. The solicitation of funds, there will be a solicitation of funds and acknowledgement of sponsors' variance power, like that provision will be included there. And want to ensure that here in the Model C, there is a proper accounting of funds by the sponsor and by the grantee. Remember, there is reporting that goes both ways. And of course, the reports from the grantee to the sponsor will be part of implementing this model.
Just a couple of things to add, or nuances. The gold standard is, or the default, I guess, is that the sponsor's board will approve all of these. In some cases, depending on the size, volume, There may be a board committee, that's created to review some of this, but it shouldn't just be, or typically at least, it shouldn't just be kind of one person who is deciding whether or not to accept projects. There needs to be some more robust processes usually. And then the other thing, right, you already said it, Wendy, that the written grant agreement, that is the fiscal sponsorship agreement. Sometimes in Model C, it's called fiscal sponsorship grant agreement. And that's almost like an omnibus agreement that governs any time grants are made by the sponsor to the grantee to support the purposes of the project. Then it's governed by the terms of that fiscal sponsorship agreement, as opposed to having to have a separate full-blown grant agreement every time there is a distribution made. Okay.
Okay, great. So regardless of the model of fiscal sponsorship agreement that you may have, there are some key provisions that we think we wanted to highlight for you all to be aware of as just really important. One, the restricted fund. What does the fiscal sponsorship agreement define the restricted fund as, and what is included in that fund? Ownership of the project's IP or other assets, personnel, who is employed by the sponsor, who's not employed by the sponsor, who's working on the project. Reporting, the frequency and the content of the grantee or the sponsor reports. We want to make sure that's pretty clear in the sponsorship agreement. The administrative fee, so defining the percentage and how it's calculated and ensuring that you as a project, that you understand how the administrative fee is calculated. So not just that it's in the grant agreement, but that you fundamentally understand it. Third-party contracting, so the definition of the degree of notice and oversight. This probably comes up more in Model A, where the project may want to consult with a third-party vendor and the contracting party will be the sponsor. You want to make sure that you as the project have given the sponsor enough time to review the consultant or the agreement or whatever the case may be, so that they are okay with approving, with not just approving, but signing on as a party to that third-party contract. Any sponsorship policies that are incorporated by reference into the fiscal sponsorship agreement, but aren't necessarily attached. You want to make sure that you understand them and you're compliant with them. And of course, last but definitely not least, any termination provisions. So understanding what triggers termination, who can initiate the termination, what are the timing, mechanics, notice, approval that's required to terminate the relationship. This is not a all-inclusive list, but these are ones that we wanted to highlight to you and that fit on the slide.
Exactly. Yeah, policies are often the stuff that's just more granular and honestly may change from time to time, whereas the terms of the fiscal sponsorship agreement itself shouldn't really change. I mean, they can, there can be amendments, but the policies are things like, who do you talk to about XYZ? How much advance notice do you have to give of, this or that? And other details. But there aren't boilerplate usually. So like Wendy said, if you're a project, you really got to know what they say and ask questions before you proceed. Let's see. Okay, so before we move on to the next phase here, there's a question about template Model A and Model C fiscal sponsorship agreements. It's not part of the materials for this session. There certainly are some resources online. They may or may not be one size fits all, depending on the circumstances. So I'm not sure if you're asking as a potential sponsor, but I do recommend, I mean, I don't mean to say this in a self-serving way. It doesn't certainly have to be Adler and Coleman, but I do recommend that if you are a fiscal sponsor, that you look for, that you work with counsel to make sure that they're accurately reflecting your organization's priorities, and also that Sometimes if you just pull something off the shelf or the virtual internet shelf, there's a risk that it's either going to be more conservative or more permissive than your organization wants to be. So it's helpful to really think those through if with counsel if you're not yourself a lawyer. Okay. Any other questions before we move on to planned and unplanned separations? Okay, great. All right, so like I said earlier, this is a relationship, and so you sometimes got to know when to end it. There are lots of good reasons why fiscal sponsorship relationships may end. So sometimes they are designed to end. They are designed to really just be a bridge between starting out, maybe proving, that something works, and then pursuing an independent, separate, standalone 501c3, setting up your own C3, getting exemption, moving on. So that may be either, the incubated project is kind of ready to hatch. It's ready to get out there and seek its own C3 status or it attains C3 status. And that also can work in Model C. Often Model Cs are, again, it's a bridge. The Model C grantee may be a nonprofit organization that is in the process of applying for and securing C3 status. And so it gets the grants from the fiscal sponsor until that happens. Sometimes the fit just isn't right, maybe not for any truly, bad reason. It's just that, it wasn't the right fit. And so a project finds an even better fiscal sponsor and does a spin out to the new fiscal sponsor. Maybe fees are an issue. Hopefully that can be negotiated with a fiscal sponsor if everything else is working well. But sometimes, for whatever reason, the fiscal sponsor that you start with has a different approach to fees than the project's comfortable with. And then, sometimes, what did you say, Wendy? You solved world hunger. You actually figured it out. You solved the problem. And so it's time to just wind it down. And those are all relatively positive reasons. Not so positive reasons. A lot of them kind of are synonyms or tangential synonyms of one another. Mistrust, misunderstanding, miscommunication, misalignment, misuse of funds is not necessarily, it's alliterative, but it's not necessarily a synonym. Accounting lapses by the sponsor, or sometimes, I know I'm mostly talking about things from the project's point of view, but sometimes projects misuse funds chronically or don't abide by the sponsor's, guidelines or out of compliance. And so it may be time to end things. But accounting lapses by the sponsor, misuse by the sponsor of the funds can be a big reason to end the relationship voluntarily, or of course, if the sponsor essentially implodes, that can be a unplanned separation. So what about those unplanned endings? The really obvious questions that come up really all often revolve around, for the project, what happens to the money that we fundraised, the money that we fundraised, the assets that we created for funders, what happens to the money that we donated. I think I mentioned at the top, I probably shouldn't have started with that kind of a sour note, but there's not a really magic wand. If in fact we're talking about an unplanned ending where the sponsor themselves is imploding, basically. However, it is important for the project to know its role. So depending on the model, so let's take both of the two models. So model A, where you've got a direct project model, and so the personnel are employed by the sponsor, and the expenditures were sponsors' expenditures associated with pursuing the project. It's important to know what kind of contractual obligations the sponsor made that were associated with the project. There may be third parties that have something to say. We are not bankruptcy attorneys or creditors' rights attorneys. We should just point that out. But there may be, depending on the circumstances, a reason why you may want to consult with that type of counsel, those kinds of experts, to know whether or not there are any viable claims depending on the existing contractual relationships and obligations. And honestly, that's true for Model C grantees as well. Is there an outstanding grant agreement or a commitment that was made that has not yet been fulfilled? The tension that I flagged earlier with fiscal sponsorship is that the funds in those restricted funds, restricted for the purposes of the various projects, consistent with the project's purposes, those belong to the sponsor until the sponsor, makes a grant or pays a bill or cuts a check. They're the funds that are held by the fiscal sponsor are, as Wendy pointed out at the beginning, as we talked about a bit, they are impressed with charitable trust. Like funders generally don't make that many general support grants, general operating unrestricted grants to fiscal sponsors if we're talking about a fiscal sponsorship model, right? So the funds that are held by the fiscal sponsor are impressed with charitable trust. However, who has the right under law to make a claim against a fiscal sponsor to enforce that charitable trust is not necessarily it's not necessarily the funder if there's not a separate contractual right. It's the Attorney General. So depending on, again, the contracts that are in place, depending on the facts and the circumstances, that will affect who has recourse and in what way. Knowing what the fiscal sponsorship agreement says, any other kinds of ancillary agreements, knowing how it articulates the sponsor's obligations, knowing what the termination provisions say. Like it's possible that in some, I have seen fiscal sponsorship agreements that have very strong project favoring termination provisions that allow projects to essentially say, I've got a fiscal sponsor that's above reproach and I'm ready to transfer everything out. It's possible that there's something there to trigger, at least to get some of the non-cash assets transferred out. So bottom line again, get clear on the lay of the land for your specific situation and seek appropriate counsel. So any questions on any of that? Yes, I think I'll let the JDC folks answer Susanna's question, but I believe they will be available.
Yeah, we're happy to share the slides and also a recording of this presentation with everyone.
Great. So this is just some resources. Folks asked about templates and things like that. I'm not sure there'll be a lot of that here, but they do exist. So Sarah already mentioned the book, so I don't feel as bad about mentioning the book. So the book is Fiscal Sponsorship: 6 Ways to Do It Right, now in its 3rd edition. Greg Colvin of Adler and Colvin did, he's now retired, but he wrote the book, and it is available at that, but there are a lot of other resources as well. There's, and I've listed some of them here. I mentioned the nonprofit law blog at Neo Law Group has a great list of kind of how to find a fiscal sponsor resources. They've got a lot of other resources. Jean and Aaron and crew are a great resource. And then there are also, if you are a sponsor, National Network of Fiscal Sponsors is a great kind of professional network for information sharing. And they have an annual conference that's great. So there's a lot of resources. I think, let's see. So I think that's sort of the end of the prepared remarks. I think we're ending around the time we thought we'd open it up for questions. I know we've been answering some throughout, but if anyone wants to, I'm looking here at the chat, but if anyone wants to raise their hand, Sarah, Rachel, just tell me if I should pull this down for that part of the conversation.
Yeah, I think that would be appropriate. We can stop screen sharing at this point. And thank you both for that. Very informative. I learned quite a bit. So we really appreciate that, the depth of the information that you all shared and your expertise. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So I'm looking at the chat. So there's a question about the funds that were given belonging legally to the sponsor. Yes, so the idea here is that the funds are being contributed to the fiscal sponsor. And typically the funder will say something like, we're contributing, X dollars to fiscal sponsor for the purposes to support the uh, purposes of, XYZ project. And then, or, it'll describe the project or it'll describe the purposes. And so the sponsor holds those funds. Sometimes, depending on its policies and depending on the agreement that it has with, let's say, a Model C fiscal sponsor, it may make a regrant to that grantee that is operating the project relatively quickly. Maybe not, may depend on what the funder wants. In a Model A, it's going to hold those funds and then it's going to essentially pay the expenses of the project as they come up, including compensation costs for personnel. So there's also a follow-up question about what projects should ask for to ensure receiving funds. So most of the time, a sponsor will have some system. I mean, a well-run sponsor should have some system for both tracking the what's in the restricted fund, the sort of ins and outs in the restricted funds, and accounting to project personnel for what has come in and what has gone out. So if that isn't there, if that system isn't there, that kind of practice isn't there, then that is a red flag. But I have seen situations where a sponsor maybe started strong in that regard, and then someone made a point about changes in personnel and maybe some of the processes kind of get a little weaker and weaker, but that's the kind of thing that should be happening pretty consistently. And if it's is not happening or isn't happening as well or as frequently, then that's at least a yellow flag. Okay. Amy, did you want to ask your question out loud?
Yeah, it's a hi, thanks. And thanks for all this. This is great. Yeah, it felt like too much to type. But I just wanted to get your thoughts. We're currently fiscally sponsored and we're in, I believe, kind of the Model A
Mhm.
situation. Um, and there's been discussion about what I'm not sure if this is a Model C or what this is, but basically a conversation about creating a separate LLC and
Hmm.
then placing our organization under that LLC. So I was curious to hear anything about that because I'm unsure of what that would mean and what would that mean for us. And um, but but my understanding is that we would still be able to operate under their 501(c)(3) and receive, donations in that way. But
Yeah.
yeah.
So what you're describing, I don't know for sure. I am answering at a high level as opposed to giving specific advice, but maybe Model L, it is sometimes called Model L, L for LLC. If you look at kind of the list of models, it's like A, B, C, D, LFG or something like that. I forget how they've gotten as the editions of the book have gone on, they've gotten a little different. But Model L effectively is a Model A, but with a little different structure to enhance some separation of liabilities from project activities versus kind of everything else that the sponsor is doing or all the other projects that the sponsor is sponsoring. So it would still be essentially, the subsidiary you mentioned is a single member limited liability company, LLC, of which the sponsor is the sole member. And for tax purposes, that entity is disregarded. So it looks exactly like Model A for tax purposes. But for purposes of contracting, for sort of state law purposes and for purposes of being a contractor, for purposes of creditors' rights and all of the kind of risk issues that come up and knowing who's liable. The entity is the one engaged in the contracts and, that would have the risk. And so there's some risk separation. It's not for everyone. And I think going into those details are probably a little bit beyond scope, but that's
Yeah.
probably what they're describing.
Got it. Okay. Sorry, this was probably too specific, but I'm just curious, would it, so then, okay, under Model A, so they would still hold the finances. It would still be one bank account theoretically, and yeah.
Probably. I mean,
Okay.
there's a lot of different ways to do it.
Okay.
So yeah, that probably is a little more specific, but
Yeah.
at least you know that it has a name.
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. Who else? Let's see, a group decides to do a one-time fundraising event with a specific charitable purpose. Uh, okay, sorry, I should read it. A group decides to do a one-time fundraising event with specific charitable purpose, or nonprofit is the recipient. Would this be fiscal sponsorship if it's done under a C3? So I'm not sure who the group is. This could also be something called if it's just a for-profit that does the fundraiser, or holds the fundraising event, there's some other issues that might be implicated. It's not necessarily fiscal sponsorship just based on how you've described it, but I'd need to know more probably to know whether it's professional fundraising or a commercial co-venture kind of situation or some other things that are not fiscal sponsorship but are regulated. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm sorry, Alexander. I don't know quite. I'm not I'm not totally following the 212 question and the 214 question, but I think our email addresses are in the materials, so feel free to reach out if you have a question.
I could ask the question quickly.
Okay.
Thank you. So this is a situation in which a fiscal sponsor relationship is failing or ending, and does the project have the ability to go to court and say, you have my money or our money? It needs to come to us.
So
And you
that's
said
kind of what
earlier
I
that
was.
only the AG can do that. That's the question I really had.
It was the last thing you said? You're assuming,
You
oh,
said
only the
earlier,
AG. That's right.
yeah.
I mean, essentially, depending on the circumstances, depending on whether there is a contractual right that the project can point to. If it's just a matter of funds being held to support the purposes of that project, and there's no contractual right that says this money is going to be going to XYZ person, then it may just be something that is for the AG to enforce.
Thank you.
Okay. So can an organization that's fiscally sponsored, like Model C, do their own fundraising and transfer to the sponsor on a yearly basis? I think that probably depends on why you were in a fiscal sponsorship. Some folks are like staying in a fiscal sponsorship even after they have C3 status, just because they want to kind of outsource a lot of the back office. But assuming a sort of classic Model C regrant relationship, that's a little backwards. I think if the grantee doesn't have C3 status, then it wouldn't be moving money to the fiscal sponsor after receiving it. It's going to go the other direction, but I may be misunderstanding the kind of fact pattern you're describing. But sorry, but you asked about fundraising and absolutely usually the fiscal sponsorship agreement, or at least a good fiscal sponsorship agreement, will address the sponsor's expectations about fundraising and any limitations that it wants to place on fundraising by the project or the project personnel. And often the grantee is the one that's going out and doing the fundraising, but under guidelines if it's using the sponsor's name under guidelines that have been set by the sponsor, and the funds are being contributed to the sponsor to support, again, the project purposes. Okay. Did we get most of them?
I think we have.
Can a sponsee project have more than one sponsor? Yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I have seen fiscal sponsors who only do exclusive relationships and others that are open to being one of, more than one fiscal sponsors. Um, Typically it's more of a, it's more of a one fiscal sponsor kind of situation, but you could imagine certainly in a Model C kind of context where that's not necessarily the case. Um, so. So I know that there were other questions, but I also want to be mindful. So we have 9 minutes. I don't know, Sarah and Jerry, if you wanted all nine or if we should do another question or two before handing the baton back to you, whichever you prefer.
I'm happy to give you a few more minutes to answer questions here. Jerry, I think is 5 minutes okay for you at the end?
Yeah, that's perfectly fine.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks for
First
sharing.
questions there.
Wendy, were there ones that haven't been covered that were sent in advance that we wanted to make sure we lifted up?
I think we covered
I covered a lot
most
of
of these.
them.
Yeah, we
Mm-hmm.
covered most of these. I'm looking at them.
Mm-hmm. So someone did ask about what's the best thing to do if your fiscal sponsor doesn't have the capacity to continue. And I think hopefully if that person was able to attend, they got some information on that. It's obviously better if you can unwind it while everyone's still friends. Because hopefully, the fiscal sponsor themselves are aware of their capacity limitations. That's not always the case. But if things can be unwound in a way that's, professional and amicable, that's obviously for the best. And that happens all the time. We left out of this session a sort of further deeper dive on what a good termination agreement looks like. But there are termination and spin out agreements. It's a standard thing that happens in fiscal sponsorship relationships. And so it's something you can ask at the beginning of the relationship. Hey, how do you usually manage a spin out? And the answers will be useful. But if you're in the middle of one, then I recommend, again, if you know it's time to leave, leave, but leave in a way that is doesn't burn any bridges for either party.
I'm looking at the list of questions. One that is probably enough to prompt a whole other webinar is someone submitted a question, how to protect our organization when our fiscally sponsored groups are handling programs in fraught areas like immigration counseling. Especially in this political environment, there are many areas that would be considered fraught areas, but I think clean documentation, ensuring that if there were a congressional investigation that one of your projects would be subject to, and we have seen that some of our clients who started off as fiscal sponsored projects but became their own C3s have been targets of congressional investigations. And sometimes those investigations go back to when they were still under but under a fiscal sponsor, right? And so how to think that was submitted by a fiscal sponsor. So how to protect projects, right? That may be doing work that is fraught currently. So we won't have time to get into all of that, but I think it just goes back to what we've talked about, which is, having clear documentation of what's going on, and also having a sense of, what are the groups that are kind of being targeted, and if, consulting, right, and talking to other folks in the sector, that specific sector. Sounds like that, immigrant serving organizations. How are they dealing with this? What are the resilient and resistance factors? That's what we talk about when we're talking about this internally. What are the ways that you can continue doing the work that your project is doing despite the risk, and understanding the risk tolerance that you as a sponsor may have, but also the project.
Yeah, I would just the last thought on that is that, fiscal sponsors are charities too. So it's not that a lot of the things we're talking about or that Wendy was talking about, those aren't just specific to fiscal sponsors. The question was really about, what you're doing. If you're a fiscal sponsor, you also have sister organizations and not in just good old operating charities who are doing similar work. And whether it's your kind of subsector or otherwise, what can you do to do a risk assessment to kind of harden the target to make sure that you're operating in a way that is as above reproach as possible, so that yeah, resistance and resilience is as Wendy said. So on that note, sorry, we left you only with 4 minutes, Jerry.
No, no worries. That is plenty, and I'm happy to jump in here. A quick introduction. I want to say hi. My name is Jerry Trotter. I'm the Nonprofit Resource Development Specialist for the Business Development Division at the San Francisco's Office of Economic and Workforce Development. Our work is sector focused, and in my role, I like to make myself available to assist nonprofit businesses to navigate resources in the sector. After this, I'll put my information in the chat. But aside of that kind of quick introduction, I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this Fiscal Sponsorship 101 webinar. We hope you found the session informative and valuable as I have. I'd like to extend a deep gratitude to our esteemed speakers from Atler and Colvin, Nancy and Wendy, and the Justice Diversity Center court program, Sarah and Rachel, for sharing their expertise, their coordination for this activity and this event, and all their insights. Their navigations and guidance on this complex subject matter as fiscal sponsorship is invaluable. As has been said multiple times in this conversation, Adler and Coven have literally written a book on this subject matter, and as I'm sure you found in this conversation and with your thoughtful questions, things have some nuance to them, but they also require kind of deep consideration and thought. We encourage you to apply these principles to your projects and continue exploring the benefits of fiscal sponsorship, as it can be a great resource and tool for organizations to use, particularly when done correctly and done thoughtfully. Should you have any further questions or need additional support, Nancy and Wendy have offered themselves. The court program is ongoing and always there for transactional support. And as I said, I will also put my contact information and link for engagement with the nonprofit leaders or community engagement in the chat as well. So please do not hesitate to reach out. And lastly, just thank you once again for your participation and your engagement in this. It's been very robust conversation and informative. So thank you again, Nancy and Wendy and the court team.
Thank you, Jerry. Thanks.
Thanks, Jerry. And thank you everyone for coming. We're really thrilled that we had such a great turnout. It was wonderful to have you all here. And thanks again to our fabulous speakers and to Jerry as a wonderful partner. I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Thank you.
Take care.